December of 1098. The city of Mahara, Al-Nan in northern Syria, the siege had lasted 2 weeks, and the walls had finally broken, not through strategy, but through the sheer weight of desperate men climbing ladders. In the dark, while defenders poured boiling oil down the stones, a woman named Yasmin was in the cellar beneath her home. She was 31 years old. Her husband, a cloth merchant, had been killed on the walls 3 days earlier. She crouched in the darkness with her 2 daughters, 9 and 6, pressed against her body beneath the floorboards of the only home they had ever known. Above her, the city was dying. First, the clash of metal that meant fighting in the streets, then screaming as though violence moved beyond soldiers and into homes, then the crashing of doors broken open, repeating at intervals as soldiers moved house to house, then silence from each home after the door was breached. Each silence was a family, each silence was an ending. The crusaders who poured through Mahara's walls had been marching for 3 years. They had walked from France and Norman Italy across a continent through a disease that killed more of them than any army, through a hunger so severe their bodies had been consuming themselves. For months they had besieged Antioch for 8 months and nearly starved. Outside its walls, what remained was something that suffering and religious fervor had forged into a weapon without a safety mechanism. These men believed that God had sent them to reclaim the holy land, that every enemy killed was an enemy of Christ, that everything they did inside conquered cities was sanctioned by divine authority. The massacre at Mahara killed an estimated 20,000 people. The city had no military garrison. It was a market town. Its people were merchants, craftspeople, farmers who had sheltered behind the walls when the Frankish army appeared. They were civilians in every sense. What happened after the killing was so extreme that even the Crusader chroniclers could not suppress it. Fulcher of Chartres, a priest who celebrated every victory as God's favor, recorded that soldiers consumed the flesh of the dead. Rado of Caen confirmed it. Albert of Aachen added detail. The cannibalism at Mahara is documented by multiple independent sources because too many witnesses saw it, but the chroniclers, who could not avoid mentioning the eating of the dead, found it easy to avoid mentioning what happened to the living, the women of Mahara, what was done to them before and during the massacre. These details appear in the Arab sources with a precision that suggests the historians who recorded them understood they were preserving something the other side would erase. They were right. For 900 years, the Western version told Mahara as a regrettable access by starving men. It did not tell the story of the women in the cellars. That story was written. It was simply never translated into languages that Western school children were taught to read. You have heard of the Crusades. You learned about them in school. Knights in armor riding toward Jerusalem under the banner of the cross. Richard, the Lionheart facing Saladin across the desert. A clash of civilizations fought between armies on battlefields in the Holy Land. That is the version. It is not false, it is incomplete in a way that amounts to the same thing. The Crusades were not fought between armies on open fields. They were were fought through. Cities through streets filled with civilians who had nowhere to go when the walls were breached, the primary victims of every crusader siege, every sack, every conquest were not soldiers, they were the people who lived behind this walls, women, children, the elderly, merchants and craftspeople whose only connection to the military conflict was the misfortune of living in a city that someone with an army wanted to take. Western chronicles celebrated the military victories. Arab chronicles documented what happened to the people left behind for 900 years. Western historians drew primarily from Western sources and produced a version of the Crusades that omitted what those sources omitted. The Arab accounts were available, manuscripts preserved in libraries across the Islamic world. They were not consulted, not translated, not taught. The result was a 900-year gap in the historical record, not because the evidence was missing, but because no one with the authority to shape Western education considered the evidence relevant if you want to understand what actually happened to women during 2 centuries of holy war, what happened in the hours after the walls fell, the period that Crusader chroniclers skipped, and Arab historians recorded in devastating detail. Then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that subscribe button, because what I'm about to reveal comes from both sides of the conflict, from Latin chronicles and Arabic manuscripts, from the words of priests who marched with the army and the words of historians who buried the dead after the army left. This is the Crusades as they were experienced by the people history forgot to ask. Stay until the end, because the fragments of women's voices that survive from this era, hidden in court records and poetry and the margins of manuscripts, have waited 9 centuries to be heard, to understand what happened to women during the Crusades. You need to understand what kind of army arrived at the walls of their cities. It was not a professional military force. It was not an organized campaign staffed by trained soldiers, operating under a chain of command with rules of engagement. It was something the medieval world had never produced before and would never produce again. In November of 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in central France and called upon Christendom to march east and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. The speech itself does not survive in a reliable version, but its effects are documented beyond dispute. Urban offered something that no pope had offered before: complete absolution of sins for anyone who took the cross. Every crime you had committed, every sin that weighed on your soul, every punishment that awaited you in the afterlife, wiped clean, erased. All you had to do was march to Jerusalem and fight for God. The response was overwhelming. Tens of thousands answered, knights and nobles, yes, but they were the minority. The majority were peasants, farmers with no land, debtors fleeing obligations, younger sons who would inherit nothing, criminals who saw the cross as a pardon, men with nothing to lose and everything to gain from a journey that promised spiritual salvation and material reward. Simultaneously, they brought their families, they brought their hatreds, they brought the accumulated frustrations of lives lived at the bottom of a feudal system offered them no future, and they channeled all of it into a religious mission that told them God wanted them to kill. The journey east took 3 years, and it destroyed them, not militarily, psychologically. The army crossed the Byzantine Empire, fought Turkish forces at Doram, and then entered a landscape of heat and scarcity that European peasants were completely unprepared for. Disease killed them. Waves, dysentery, typhoid, infections from wounds that festered. The heat, starvation thinned them. Further, supply lines that had never been adequate collapsed entirely during the 8-month siege of Antioch, where the Crusaders ate their horses, then their leather equipment, then whatever they could find in the surrounding countryside, until the countryside had nothing left to give. By the time the army moved south from Antioch toward Jerusalem, the men who remained were not the men who had left Europe. They had been transformed by 3 years of suffering into something that operated on desperation and faith in equal measure. They believed God was testing them. They believed their suffering was purification. They believed that the cities ahead of them contained not just enemies but enemies of God, and that whatever they did to those enemies was not just permitted but righteous. The religious framework that had motivated the crusade did not restrain the violence, it authorized it. A soldier who killed in God's name was performing an act of worship. A soldier who took plunder from a conquered city was accepting God's reward, and a soldier who seized a woman from a conquered population was claiming property that God had given him through victory. This was the army that arrived at the gates of Antioch, of Mahara, of Jerusalem. Starving, brutalized, absolutely certain that divine authority sanctioned everything they were about to do, and the people behind those gates, the women and children and elderly who had no army to protect them and no walls strong enough to keep out men who had walked 3 years to reach them, had no idea what was coming. Antioch fell in June of 1098, and it established the pattern that would repeat at every major Crusader conquest for the next 2 centuries. The city had held out for 8 months. The Crusaders had nearly died outside its walls when a traitor opened a gate in the night, and the army poured through. The violence that followed carried the accumulated fury of those 8 months of starvation and disease. The military garrison was overwhelmed with hours. What happened next was not a battle, it was a sack. The army moved through the city systematically, district by district, breaking open homes, killing men, looting everything portable. The Guest of Franorum, the primary Latin chronicle of the First Crusade, written by an anonymous Norman knight who was present, describes the fall of Antioch as a glorious victory. God delivered the city into Frankish hands. The enemy was scattered. The narrative moves quickly from the breach to the aftermath, skipping the hours between with a practiced efficiency that characterizes every Western account of every Crusader city sack. The Arab chronicler, writing from the other side, did not skip those hours. He describes the Crusaders entering homes and killing the men they found inside. He describes women dragged into the streets. He describes the separation of women from their families as a deliberate process conducted amid The chaos of the sack, soldiers, identifying women and pulling them from groups of civilians the way a buyer at market identifies the goods he wants. From a larger inventory, the selection happened in real time while killing continued in adjacent streets. Soldiers paused to evaluate which women to seize and which to leave. Youth was their primary criterion. A young woman was taken, an old woman was not. The distinction was economic rather than merciful. A young woman had value, an old woman did not. The seized women were claimed as personal property by individual soldiers. The distribution followed the hierarchy that governed all. Crusader spoils, knights and nobles claimed first, men at arms and sergeants claimed second. Common soldiers fought over what remained. The women were divided alongside gold, fabrics, horses, and weapons. They appeared in the same inventories. They were discussed in the same transactions. The language of the sources makes no distinction between human plunder and material plunder because the men conducting the distribution made no such distinction. The women taken at Antioch disappear from the Western chronicles entirely after the city's fall. They are not mentioned in accounts of the army's subsequent march south. They are not referenced in descriptions of camp life or logistics. They were absorbed into the army's economy as silently as captured horses were absorbed into his cavalry. The Arab sources tracked them slightly further. Ibn Alayya notes that captured women were held within the army's camp, that some were traded between soldiers and that others were sold to merchants who followed the Crusader army the way merchants follow any military force, buying and selling whatever the army produced as surplus. The women had entered a system. The system had no mechanism for their release because the system did not recognize them as people who could be released. They were goods. Goods are used until they are used up. Then they are discarded. This was Antioch, the first major city to fall, the first pattern established. The Crusaders would refine the process at Mahara and perfected at Jerusalem. 6 months after Antioch, the army reached Mara al-Numan. The city was small. It had no strategic value. It sat on the road south toward Jerusalem, and the Crusaders needed to pass through it. The garrison was minimal. The walls were not built to withstand a serious siege. Population was mostly civilians who had not evacuated because they had nowhere to go and because they did not yet understand what the Frankish army did to cities that resisted. Mahara resisted. For 2 weeks, when the walls broke, their army entered a city whose population was trapped inside with no escape route and no one coming to help them. What followed exceeded even Antioch. Returned to Yasmin in the cellar. She can hear the soldiers moving through her street. The crashing of doors has reached her block. She has pressed her hands over her daughter's mouths because the 6-year-old has started to cry, and the sound carries through the floorboards into the house above. The cellar is small, dug into the earth beneath the kitchen, used for storing grain and oil. It is dark. It smells of earth and the sesame oil that leaked from a cracked jar when she was carrying supplies down. 2 weeks ago, she can hear boots on the floor above her. She can hear voices speaking a language she she does not understand Frankish, a guttural sound full of hard consonants that the people of the Levant had never heard before 3 years ago, and that now meant one thing only: the cellar door was found, every cellar door in Mara was found. The soldiers had learned at Antioch that civilians hid below ground. They searched systematically. They opened every hatch, every trapdoor, every entrance to every space beneath, every building. What they found below, they dragged above. The Arab sources described this process with the specificity of witnesses documenting a method rather than a moment. It was not frenzy, it was procedure. The massacre lasted 2 days. The killing was comprehensive, but it was not uniform as at Antioch. A selection process operated within the chaos. Young women were separated from the general population before the killing reached them. Old women were not children clinging to their mothers. Complicated the selection. Some soldiers took the mother and left the child. Some took both. Some killed the child to simplify the transaction. The decisions were individual, made by individual men, operating under no authority except their own judgment about what had value and what did not. Fuhrer of Charter could not avoid recording the cannibalism because too many of his fellow chroniclers had witnessed it. He could avoid recording what happened to the women because the other chroniclers had avoided it too. Silence was collaborative. Each Western source that omitted the treatment of women made the next omission easier. The Arab sources operated under no such collaboration. Ibn al-Lathir recorded what the Frankish soldiers did to the women of Mara with the deliberate precision of a man who understood that if he did not write it, no one on his side would know, and no one on the other side would admit it. He described women taken from cellars, women seized in the streets while trying to flee, women held in groups while soldiers selected among them. What happened to the selected women afterward he describes in terms that require no interpretation across any cultural or linguistic barrier. The words are plain, the meaning is absolute. 9 centuries have not made them easier to read. Yasmin and her daughters were in that cellar, whether they survived the selection or did not, whether they were taken or killed, whether their story ended in Mahar or continued into the captive system that the Crusaders were building with each conquered city is not recorded. They are 3 of 20,000. Their names are not in any chronicle. Their fate is a silence, shaped like a family, one of thousands of such silences scattered across the historical record of the First Crusade. 7 months after Mahara, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. July 15th, 1099. The city fell after a 5-week siege. What followed was the defining atrocity of the crusading era, described by both Western and Arab sources with a convergence that is rare in medieval historiography. The two sides agree on what happened. They disagree only on whether it was justified. The Crusaders breached the northern wall near the gate of the column. They poured into the city. The killing began immediately, and it did not stop for 2 days. Raymond of Aguilaris, Crusader chaplain who was present, wrote that soldiers waited in blood up to their ankles in the Temple Mount. Complex, he recorded this not with horror but with satisfaction, interpreting the blood as evidence of divine judgment upon the enemies of Christ. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum confirmed the scale, so did Fulcher of Chartres, who arrived shortly after and saw the aftermath. The Muslim population was targeted without distinction, men, women, children. Elderly Ibn Alayah recorded that 70,000 people were killed in the Temple Mount area alone. Modern historians consider this number inflated, but agree that the massacre was vast, encompassing the majority of the city's Muslim population. The killing was not the frenzied chaos of men out of control. Multiple sources describe organized sweeps through neighborhoods, soldiers moving in groups from building to building, clearing each structure before moving to the next. The methodology that had been developed at Antioch and refined at Mahara reached its fullest expression at Jerusalem. Within this organized killing, the same selection process operated. Young women were separated from the groups of civilians being herded through the streets toward the killing grounds. The selection happened in real time amid active slaughter. A soldier would pull a woman from a crowd that was being driven toward execution. The crowd continued. The woman did not. She was held while the people she had been standing among moments earlier were killed within her sight and hearing. The psychological dimension of this selection is difficult to overstate. To be chosen was to survive, but survival meant watching everyone around you die and understanding that you had been spared not out of mercy, but out of utility. Your life had been preserved because your body had been assessed as having value. The alternative was visible in the streets around you. Women selected at Jerusalem entered the same distribution system that had operated at Antioch and Mahara. Knights claimed first, lesser soldiers claimed after. The scale was larger because Jerusalem was larger and because the army that took it was operating at the peak of its power and its conviction that everything it did was righteous. Raymond de Vega mentions the seizure of women in passing, a subordinate clause in a sentence about the distribution of spoils, as if the taking of human beings was no more remarkable than the taking of gold or silk. For the chronicler, it was not the women were plundered was the army's right. God had given them this city and everything in it. The Arab historian Al-Kalani, writing from Damascus, recorded the fall of Jerusalem with a grief that penetrates across the centuries. He describes the killing, the looting, the burning, and he describes the women taken from their homes, separated from the dead and the dying, led away by men who spoke a language they could not understand toward a future they could not imagine. His account does not use a euphemism. He names what happened with the directness of a man who understood that clarity was the only weapon available to him. The Crusaders had swords, he had words, and he used them with a precision designed to ensure that what the other side's chroniclers emitted, his chronicle would preserve. The seizure of women during the Crusades was not chaos, it evolved across the campaigns into a structured practice with understood rules. Economic dimensions, and a legal framework that the Crusader states formalized once they were established when the First Crusade ended and the Crusaders built their kingdoms in the Levant, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch. They needed legal codes to govern their new territories. The Asses of Jerusalem, compiled over the 12th century, became the primary legal framework. Within these laws, the status of captured Muslim civilians was addressed with a specificity that confirms how routine the practice had become. Captured persons were classified as property. They could be owned, sold, transferred, inherited. The legal language made no meaningful distinction between a captured woman and a captured horse. Both were assets acquired through conquest. Both were subject to the same property laws. The distribution of captured women followed the feudal hierarchy that governed every aspect of Crusader society. A lord who commanded siege was entitled to a share of all spoils, including human spoils. His knights received shares proportional to their rank and contribution. Men-at-arms received less. Common soldiers received what remained. The allocation was not informal. It was governed by custom that carried the force of law, and disputes over the distribution of captured women were adjudicated by the same courts that settled disputes over land and livestock. This system meant that the seizure of women was not an aberration committed by undisciplined soldiers. It was an institution built into the legal and economic structure of the Crusader states, with the same deliberation that was applied to taxation and land tenure. A knight who took a woman during a city sack was exercising a legal right. Lord who received his share of captured women was collecting revenue owed to him by the customs of war. The women had been converted from people into a category of income processed through a legal system that had been designed by men who considered themselves Christian and civilized, and who attended Mass every Sunday in churches built on the foundations of mosques they had converted. Think about what this means. For a moment, the Crusaders did not simply commit acts of violence against women during the chaos of battle and move on. They built a civilization in the Levant that incorporated the ownership of captured women into its legal foundations. They wrote laws about it. They adjudicated disputes about it. They passed women as property from father to son through inheritance. They created a society where a man's wealth could be measured partly in the number of captured women his household contained. The violence of the siege was temporary. The system it fed was permanent, and the women inside that system had no legal mechanism to challenge their status, because the law that governed them had been written by the men who owned them. Let me know in the comments what you think it means when a society builds its laws around the ownership of human beings and calls itself a kingdom of God. Because the system did not stop at ownership, it extended into commerce and the markets, where women were bought and sold, operated in the open in daylight, in the ports of the Holy Land. What daily life looked like for a captured woman inside the Crusader states depended entirely on the man who claimed her. The spectrum of experience was wide, but the spectrum existed entirely within captivity. The best outcome was still imprisonment. The worst was something that the Arab sources describe with a grief that suggests the historians who recorded it had spoken to survivors at the more controlled end. Captured women were absorbed into Frankish households as domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, washing, maintaining the homes that Crusader lures had seized from the Muslim families who built them. A woman who had lived in a house as its owner's wife now cleaned the same house as its new owner's servant. She walked the same rooms, she cooked in the same kitchen. She slept in a space that had been her home and was now her prison. Psychological architecture of this arrangement was devastating, even when the physical treatment was not overtly violent. Everything familiar had been inverted. The walls that had once meant safety now meant confinement. The rooms where she had raised her children were occupied by strangers who spoke a language she was learning to understand only through necessity. Usama ibn Monk, a 12th century Arab nobleman who lived alongside the Crusaders and recorded his observations with a sharp and often sardonic eye, describes encounters with Muslim women in Frankish households. His memoir, The Kab Alba, is one of the most valuable sources on daily life in the Crusader states. Because Usama moved between the two worlds with unusual freedom, he describes women who served in Crusader homes with a status that he recognized as indistinguishable from slavery. They could not leave, they could not refuse work, they could not communicate with their families or with the broader Muslim community without their owners' permission, which was rarely granted. They could not practice their faith openly because the households they served were Christian, and the display of Islamic practice was not tolerated. The women had no legal recourse. The Assis of Jerusalem provided protections for Frankish women, for Christian settlers, for the free population of the Crusader states. Captured Muslim women existed outside these protections entirely. They could not petition a court, they could not appeal to a magistrate, they could not testify. Their legal personhood had been erased at the moment of capture and replaced with a status that the law recognized only as property. A woman who was mistreated by her owner had the same legal options as a horse that was mistreated by its rider. None at the other end of the spectrum. The Arab sources describe conditions that the historians recorded in language stripped of ornament, as if the facts themselves were terrible enough without literary embellishment. Women held not as household servants, but as objects of use, confined to rooms, denied mobility, subjected to whatever their captors demanded, with no possibility of refusal and no audience for complaint. These accounts are scattered across multiple Arab sources from the 12th and 13th centuries. They are consistent with each other. They are consistent with what is known about the treatment of captured women in every medieval conflict, and they describe a reality that the Western chronicles of the Crusades never acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have required the chroniclers to describe crusaders not as soldiers of Christ, but as men who did to captive women what men with absolute power over powerless women have done in every war. In every century, the women in these households lived in a silence that extended beyond their inability to speak. Their captors' language, they lived in a silence imposed by a historical tradition that did not consider their experience worth recording. The Frankish chronicles described battles, sieges, treaties, the politics of kings and popes. The Arab chronicles described the same events from the opposite perspective, neither tradition centered the women. They appear in margins, in subordinate clauses, in passing references that confirm their presence. Without exploring their experience, they were there, everyone knew they were there, nobody wrote their story. The Crusader states were not isolated kingdoms surviving on subsistence. They were commercial hubs integrated into the most sophisticated trade networks of the medieval world. The ports of Ara, Tyre, and Tripoli connected the Levant to the maritime economies of the Mediterranean. Goods flowed through these ports in volumes that generated enormous wealth for the Italian merchant republics that controlled the shipping lanes. Venice, Genoa, Pisa, these cities did not merely support the Crusades with ships and supplies, they profited from them, and among the goods that flowed through Crusader ports were human beings. Slave markets operated openly in Acre. They were not hidden in back alleys or conducted in whispers. They were regulated commercial operations that generated tax revenue for the Crusader authorities. The Kingdom of Jerusalem taxed the sale of captured persons the way it taxed the sale of spices and textiles as a legitimate category of commerce subject to the same customs, duties, and record-keeping requirements. The markets had physical locations. They had regular operating hours. They had merchants who specialized in the trade, the way other merchants specialized in silk or pepper. Women captured during military campaigns entered these markets through the same distribution chain that began on the battlefield. A soldier who had claimed a woman as his share of spoils could keep her or sell her. Many sold. A soldier needed cash more than he needed a captives. Markets provided liquidity. A woman who had been seized during the sack of Ur city might pass through multiple transactions within weeks, sold from soldier to merchant to buyer, each transaction moving her further from her home and deeper into a system that processed her as commodity. The Italian merchant republics transporting captured women by ship across the Mediterranean. This is not speculation. It is documented in the commercial archives of Genoa and Venice, cities whose meticulous record-keeping preserve the evidence of transactions their descendants would later prefer to forget. Bills of sale survive, shipping manifests survive, tax receipts, recording duties paid on human cargo survive. The documents list women by approximate age, physical condition, and origin, the same categories applied to any goods being assessed for market value. A woman from the Levant appearing in a general's commercial ledger in the 12th century is reduced to a line of text, an entry indistinguishable in format from the entry above it, recording a shipment of cotton, or the entry below it recording a consignment of dyed cloth. The markets were not small. The volume of the slave trade through Crusader ports was significant enough to attract the attention of contemporary observers on both sides. Arab historians noted the trade with a bitterness of people watching their own population being sold. Western observers noted it with the indifference of people watching commerce function as commerce does. The papal authorities occasionally issued proclamations against the sale of Christians into slavery, but were notably silent on the sale of Muslims, silence that the market operators interpreted correctly as permission. The women who passed through these markets dispersed across the Mediterranean world. Some remained in the Crusader states, some were transporting to Sicily, to southern Italy, to the Iberian Peninsula, some ended up in Constantinople. The trade routes that carried spices east to west and silk west to east also carried women in both directions, their bodies converted into a commodity that moved along the same channels as every other product of medieval commerce. They entered households in cities they had never heard of, speaking languages they did not know, serving people who knew nothing about them except what the bill of sale recorded. Their names were not on the documents, their histories were not attached to the transactions. They were units of commerce. Units do not have stories, they have prices. The suffering was not unidirectional. Muslim armies captured Frankish women with the same regularity that Crusader forces captured Muslim women. The 2 centuries of warfare that defined a crusading era produced captive populations on both sides, and the women on both sides experienced variations of the same destruction. The fall of Edessa in 1144 was the first major Crusader territory lost to Muslim reconquest. The city had been held by the Franks for nearly 50 years. Generations of Frankish settlers had been born there. When the Adabak-Zangi's forces took the city, the Frankish population that had not evacuated, women, children, elderly, clergy became prisoners. The Arab sources described the aftermath with the same categorical language that Crusader sources used when describing the fall of Muslim cities: captives taken, property seized, population distributed. The symmetry is precise and damning. Saladin's campaigns in the 1180s produced the largest captures of Frankish women during the entire crusading era. After his victory at Hattin in 1187 and the subsequent reconquest of Jerusalem and dozens of Crusader castles and towns, thousands of Frankish civilians fell into Muslim hands. Saladin's treatment of these captives was by the standards of medieval warfare, notably restrained. Multiple sources, both Arab and Western, record that he permitted ransoming of prisoners, released some women and children without payment, and issued orders against the mistreatment of captives that he enforced with visible authority. Imadin al-Sisfahani, Saladin's secretary and chronicler, describes the ransoming process in detail and records specific instances of women and children being returned, but Saladin was exceptional. Other Muslim commanders operated under fewer constraints and with less personal commitment to restraint. Babar's the Mamluk Sultan, who dismantled the remaining Crusader states in the 13th century, conducted campaigns whose Treatment of captured Frankish populations mirrored the worst of what the Crusaders had done a century and a half earlier. The fall of Antioch in 1268 produced a massacre and mass capture that Crusader sources describe with the same horror that Arab sources had used to describe the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. The comparison matters because it dismantles the comfortable narrative that either side has constructed about the other. Western histories have portrayed the Crusaders as defenders of civilization against barbarism. Arab histories have portrayed the Crusaders as uniquely savage invaders of a civilized world. Both narratives contain truth, neither contains enough truth to be honest. The treatment of captured women during the Crusades was not a product of one civilization's unique cruelty, it was a product of siege warfare itself, of the systems that every medieval army developed for processing conquered populations, of the economics that made human beings a category of plunder as routine as gold or grain. Both sides seized women, both sides sold women, both sides held women in conditions that the sources describe in terms requiring no cultural translation. The women on both sides experienced the same destruction. Frankish woman captured at Edessa and a Muslim woman captured at Jerusalem had more in common with each other than either had with the men who claimed to be fighting on her behalf. They shared the experience of being seized from their homes, of being separated from their children, of being classified as property by legal systems that have been designed without any consideration of their existence as people, of being traded through markets that converted their bodies into currency, of living the remainder of their lives in the households of strangers in lands they had not chosen to inhabit. The war was fought between civilizations. The suffering was shared across them, and the silence that followed was universal. Neither side recorded the women's experience as the women themselves would have told it. Both sides recorded it as a footnote to the military narrative that the chroniclers considered the real story. Drop a comment about what it means that history remembers only its own side's suffering and erases the suffering it caused, because the next part reveals how that eraser was maintained for 9 centuries. The treatment of women did not improve as the Crusades continued. It routinized what had been shocking at Antioch and Mahara, and Jerusalem became standard procedure, so embedded in the culture of crusading warfare that chroniclers stopped remarking on it the way a person stops remarking on the weather. It was simply the condition in which wars were fought and cities were taken and populations were processed. The Second Crusade in 1147 produced its own atrocities against civilians, poorly documented because the campaign itself was a military failure that Western chroniclers preferred to discuss as briefly as possible. The Third Crusade under Richard the Lionheart produced the massacre at Acre in 1191, where Richard ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, including women and children, in plain view of Saladin's army. The killing at Acre was a calculated act of military intimidation rather than the frenzy of a city sack, which made it in some ways more chilling. The prisoners had been held for weeks while ransom negotiations stalled. Richard decided they were more useful dead than alive. The women among them died alongside the men, executed in batches over the course of an afternoon. But the event that most thoroughly demolished the narrative of the Crusades as a war between Christianity and Islam was the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The army that departed Europe intending to attack Muslim Egypt instead attacked Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the largest Christian city in the world, the seed of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. Crusaders fighting under the banner of the cross sacked a Christian city with a ferocity that rivaled anything they had inflicted on Muslim populations. Nikos Choniates, a Byzantine historian who was present during the sack, described what happened with a fury that burns through the centuries. He describes Crusader soldiers breaking into homes and churches, looting sacred objects, desecrating altars, and he describes what they did to the women of Constantinople, Christian women who worshipped the same God. The Crusaders claimed to serve women who were dragged from churches where they had sought sanctuary, believing that soldiers of the cross would not violate sacred ground they believed wrong. Choniates describes women assaulted in churches, in homes, in the streets. He describes nuns pulled from convents. He describes the wives of Byzantine nobles seized from their households and distributed among Crusader soldiers and the Venetian merchants who had financed the campaign and who expected a return on their investment that included human plunder alongside material wealth. The women of Constantinople were not Muslim. Their city was not an enemy of Christendom. They were Christians being brutalized by Christians in a war that had been launched in Christ's name. Constantinople revealed what the earlier Crusades had demonstrated, but what the religious framing had obscured. The treatment of women during the Crusades was not driven by hatred of Islam. It was driven by the economics and psychology of siege warfare, in which women were plunder. The religion of the woman did not matter. The nationality of the woman did not matter. What mattered was that a city had fallen and the army that took it expected to be compensated with everything inside, including the people. A Muslim woman in Jerusalem and a Christian woman in Constantinople were processed through the same system with the same indifference, because the system did not distinguish between them. It distinguished only between people with swords and people without them. The routinization across 2 centuries meant that by the later Crusades, the seizure of women generated almost no commentary in any chronicle, Western or Arab. It had become invisible through repetition. The first time an atrocity occurs, it is documented as extraordinary. The 10th time, it is mentioned briefly. The 100th time, it is not mentioned at all. The silence in the later Crusader sources is not evidence that the treatment of women improved. It is evidence that it became so normal it no longer warranted a sentence. The silence was not accidental. It was constructed across 9 centuries through a process of editorial selection, so consistent that it constitutes a pattern of deliberate omission. The Latin chroniclers who documented the Crusades wrote for European audiences. They wrote for posterity, they wrote for the church that had authorized the campaigns and that needed the campaigns to be remembered as righteous. Their task was not to record everything that happened, but to record the version of events that serve the narrative of divine mission. Military victories served the narrative, acts of piety served the narrative, miracles, visions, and signs of God's favor served the narrative. The systematic seizure, sale, and abuse of civilian women did not serve the narrative, so it was omitted, not denied, not argued against, simply left out, the way a portrait painter leaves out a scar that the subject prefers not to display. The omission was made easier by the existence of an alternative record. The Arab sources documented what the Latin sources did not, but the Arab sources were written in Arabic, preserved in libraries and manuscript collections across the Islamic world, and for centuries they were inaccessible to European historians who could not read the language and who had no institutional incentive to learn. The two accounts of the Crusades existed in parallel, each complete from its own perspective, each incomplete from the others, separated by a linguistic barrier that functioned as effectively as a wall. European historians who wrote about the Crusades from the Renaissance onward drew almost exclusively from the Latin chronicles. They reproduced the omissions those chronicles contained because they had no alternative sources to fill the gaps. The version of the Crusades that entered European education was the version the Latin chroniclers had constructed, a narrative of military campaigns and religious devotion in which women appeared only as symbols. The virtuous Christian woman praying for her knight's return, the dangerous Saris temptress, the noble queen, accompanying her husband on crusade. These were literary figures, the real women, the ones in the cellars and the markets and the households of men who had killed their families, were not in the textbooks because they had never been in the Latin sources. The textbooks were built on the Arab sources, began to be translated into European languages in the 19th century. Scholars who read them encountered a version of the Crusades that contradicted the received narrative. At nearly every point, the discrepancies were stark. Events that Latin chronicles described as glorious victories, Arab chronicles described as massacres. Populations that Latin sources ignored. Arab sources documented in detail the treatment of women that Latin chroniclers omitted entirely. Appeared in Arabic manuscripts with a specificity that left no room for misinterpretation. The translations changed scholarship. Academic histories of the Crusades, published in the 20th century, began incorporating Arab sources alongside Latin ones, producing a more complete and considerably more disturbing picture. But academic scholarship and public education operate on different time scales. The revised version of the Crusades that emerged from the combination of both source traditions took decades to filter into textbooks and curricula in many Western education systems. It has not fully arrived yet. Students in European and American Schools continue to learn about the Crusades primarily through the lens of military history, siege tactics, the politics of popes and kings, the women of Antioch and Mahara, and Jerusalem and Constantinople remain in the margins, where the Latin chroniclers placed them 900 years ago, present in the sources. Absent from the story, the censorship was never a conspiracy. It was something more durable. It was a tradition, a habit of omission passed from chronicler to historian to textbook author across centuries, each generation inheriting the gaps left by the previous generation and filling them with nothing. Silence maintained by inheritance requires no effort and leaves no fingerprints. It simply persists until someone decides to listen for what is missing. Let me take you back to the cellar in Mahara to Yasmin and her two daughters. In the darkness beneath the floorboards, the soldiers have found the door. Light falls into the space where there had been none. A man is standing above them, speaking words that sound like stones being broken. Yasmin pulls her daughters closer. The 9-year-old has gone rigid. The 6-year-old is still crying. The sound of a child crying in a cellar in a city being sacked is a sound that every army in every century has heard, and that no chronicle in any language has ever adequately described. What the Arab sources tell us happened next in Mara and in every city that fell during the Crusades follows a sequence that varies in detail but never in structure. The men in the household were already dead or were killed. Now that women were pulled from their hiding places, they were evaluated: age, appearance, physical condition. The evaluation took seconds, decisions made in the time it takes to glance at a person and assign them a category. Useful, not useful, take leave. The categories determined whether you lived or died, and the determination was made by a stranger who did not speak your language and who had walked 3 years to stand in your cellar and look at you the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to carry. Yasm means daughters were 9 and 6. Their fates depended on calculations made by men whose moral framework had been replaced over 3 years of starvation and holy war with something that operated on acquisition rather than conscience. Child of 9 might have value, a child of 6 might not. These were the margins within which lives were determined. In the hours after a city fell, the women of Mahara who survived the selection entered the captive system. They were absorbed into the Crusader armies. Economy. Some were kept by the soldiers who claimed them. Some were sold within days to merchants traveling with the column. Some were carried south as the army continued its march toward Jerusalem. Present in the camp but absent from the chronicles, invisible women moving through a narrative that recorded everything except their existence. Now, multiply Yasmin's story by every city that fell during 2 centuries of crusading: Antioch, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Beirut, Acre, Caesarea, dozens of smaller towns and fortifications whose names do not appear in Western textbooks, but whose populations experienced the same sequence: walls breached, men killed, women selected, women taken, women sold, women absorbed into households and markets, and the silent economy that operated beneath the military narrative. The chroniclers were constructing for posterity. The estimated numbers are impossible to calculate precisely. Hundreds of thousands of women across multiple generations on both sides of the conflict, processed through systems that converted them from people into property and from property into silence. But fragments survive, not many, not enough, but some, in Arabic poetry from the 12th and 13th centuries, verses written by poets who had witnessed the fall of cities or who had spoken to survivors, lines that describe the grief of women taken from their homes with an emotional directness that the historical chronicles concerned with military and political narrative did not permit themselves. In Islamic court records from cities that received refugees fleeing Crusader conquests, petitions filed by women seeking legal recognition of their status, seeking information about family members, seeking any foothold in a world that had been destroyed around them, in the margins of manuscripts where scribes recorded testimonies that the formal text did not include, small voices preserved by the decision of an individual writer who chose to note what he had heard before it was forgotten. These fragments are the only direct evidence of women's experience during the Crusades that does not come filtered through the priorities of men documenting wars. They are incomplete. They are scattered across archives in Damascus, Cairo, Istanbul, and a dozen other cities. They have been studied by scholars but have not reached the general public in any form that competes with the military narrative that dominates popular understanding of the Crusades. They have been waiting for 900 years. The sites of the Crusader conquests are places you can visit. Today, Mar'a al-Nan sits in northwestern Syria, its ancient streets rebuilt and rebuilt again across the centuries since the Crusaders passed through. Jerusalem's old city draws millions of visitors each year, pilgrims and tourists walking streets where the stones absorbed blood in 1099 and absorbed it again in 1287 and have absorbed the footsteps of 9 centuries of people who came to pray in a place that has been fought over more than any other piece of ground on earth. Acre's Crusader ruins are a tourist attraction on the Israeli coast, vaulted halls and underground passages where guides describe military architecture and medieval engineering, the slave markets that operated in Acre's port district are not on the tour. The women of the Crusades left almost no direct testimony. They survive as figures in other people's accounts, mention briefly described in categories rather than as individuals. Captured, taken, seized, sold, each word a summary of an experience that no single word can contain. Behind each word is a woman who had a name, a home, a family, a life that existed before the walls were breached, a woman who cooked meals and raised children and prayed and argued and laughed and grieved and did all the things that human beings do when they are permitted to be human. The chronicles do not record these things because the chronicles were written by men who were recording wars, and in wars, women are background scenery, the landscape through which the real story moves on its way to the next battle. 900 years of historical writing about the Crusades, and the women are still in the margins, Western scholarship has begun. To correct the imbalance, the Arab sources have been translated. The academic literature has expanded. Historians who specialize in the social history of the crusading era have produced work that centers the civilian experience in ways that previous generations of scholars did not attempt. But academic correction and public understanding move at different speeds. The version of the Crusades that most people carry in their minds is still the version built from Latin chronicles and Hollywood films, knights and castles and swords gleaming in desert sunlight. The version that does not include the sellers, Yazm means name is not in any chronicle. I gave it to her because someone should. She represents the women of Mahara and of every city that fell during 200 years of holy war, women whose names were not recorded because the men who wrote the histories did not ask for them, women whose experiences were not documented because the men who documented everything else did not consider those experiences part of the story they were telling, women who existed in the spaces between the sentences of chronicles that described God's will being done on earth while omitting what that will looked like when it entered a cellar where a mother was holding her children in the team dark. They are not in the margins because their stories do not matter. They are in the margins because the people who wrote the center of the page decided that military campaigns and religious politics and the ambitions of kings were more important than what happened to a woman pulled from her home by a man who believed God has sent him to take everything she had. That decision has been repeated by every generation of historians who inherited the sources and reproduced their silences. Breaking that silence requires not new evidence, but new attention. The evidence has always been there in Arabic manuscripts, in court records, in poetry, in the fragments that survived because individual scribes chose to write down what they heard before it disappeared. The women have been waiting. 9 centuries is long enough if what you have learned today matters to you. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because the stories that history buried are the stories that most need to be unearthed. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know what the Crusades were about because the truth includes voices that have been silenced for 900 years. Drop a comment telling me what part of this history you will carry with you and tell me where you are watching from because these women belonged to every civilization and their story belongs to every generation. But the Crusades were not the only era in which the suffering of women during war was documented by one side and erased by the other. There is another chapter from another conflict where the same silence lasted even longer and the evidence was buried even deeper. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and discover what was hidden